What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. I'm Larry Rifkin. In the past, we have done podcasts on the topic of fake news. We do another because of the importance of the topic. Joining us is Paul Levinson, the author of Fake News in Real Context. We invited him into our community in front of a live audience. You'll hear their questions and you'll hear his commentary on the topic. That's next on America Trends. Now, I do want to say that I've done a number of these fake news panels for the Connecticut Humanities Council. On one, we had 3 Pulitzer Prize winners. It was a wonderful activity up in Hartford. I've done one for the Connecticut Community Foundation and one for our library. So it's something that I've kind of gotten myself into, though I'm no expert. But I do know that this is a real industry. And I do know that this is a real issue and a real problem. So I hope we can all put our own biases, and we all have them, at the side, and recognize that there's an issue here that goes well beyond the current politics of the day, but certainly is grounded in some of the divisions that we have in this country. When you take the polarization that we have in America and couple it with the technology that's available, I will paraphrase very badly Mark Twain by saying that, well, lies can be spread around the world by the time truth gets its pants on. And that's never been truer than today because of the technology. And the question of the offensive capability of people to put this stuff out and the defensive ability for Facebook, Google, others to block it is really a war that's going on in terms of who is going to help protect us. But we have a lot to do with this ourselves because, as the professor will tell us, we live in news bubbles, all of us. You only want to hear this, I only want to hear that, and so therefore we all have our own prism. Now, I know this very clearly because I'm one of 550,000 podcasters. I'll just give you that as an example. There are 550,000 podcasts, last I looked. Now, when you think about a podcast, guess who does the podcast? Well, John and I do it alone. Now, we're lucky because we have relationships with great publishers and think tanks, and we get incredible guests, and we put ourselves behind that material. But I don't have an editor. I don't have a publisher. I don't have somebody who's telling me that they're going to fact check everything that we offer. You've got to begin to trust various sources, and you've got to do some work to make certain that those sources are not there purposely and for profit to mislead you. So we're going to get into the distinctions today about this industry and its intent. You're here tonight because you're wondering, what is this whole thing about fake news? And there's been an attempt, obviously, in the political arena to obfuscate the fact that there really is such a thing as fake news. It's an industry, and it's something that we have to begin to address. So let me just pose a couple of points and questions, and then I will turn it over to Dr. Levinson. Then I'll ask him a few questions, perhaps, and then you jump in and you ask him the questions that are on your mind still after all that you've heard. So let's think about it this way, fake news. It's either a new problem or it's an age-old one, or it started with the dawn of television or the birth of CNN and the need to fill 24/7. It's either caused by or can be contained by technology. And these are all questions that I think still remain to be answered. It can either be checked by new regulation or the reimposition of old regulations, like a fairness doctrine, or perhaps more government will lead to solutions that are worse than the problem itself. And I think you will talk to that. It's obscured beyond recognition by partisans, thus making any honest assessment of it almost impossible. it's a threat to our democracy, or it's a natural outgrowth of a marketplace of ideas, unfettered and splintered, and allowed by that pesky thing we call the First Amendment. It's simply a manifestation of a divided nation looking to reinforce our biases and will self-correct when our politics adhere in the center, America's normal default position. But somehow we've gotten out to the extremes lately, and at some point it needs to adhere again. And to some, any solution requires removing the financial incentives in propagating this material. So, here we are, under the auspices of the Prospect Public Library and the Connecticut Humanities. And with us is a scholar, and that is apropos, given the fact that the Humanities Council is into serious research. Paul Levinson, Ph.D., is a professor of communication and media studies at Fordham University in New York. His nonfiction books, including The Soft Edge, Digital McLuhan, Real Space, Cell Phone, New Media, McLuhan in an Age of Social Media, and Fake News in Real Context, have been translated into 12 languages. He co-edited Touching the Face of the Cosmos on the intersection of space travel and religion in 2016. His science fiction novels include The Silk Code, winner of the Locus Award for Best First Science Fiction Novel of 1999. He has appeared on many shows. He has jousted with people like Bill O'Reilly. He's been on CNN, MSNBC, Fox, the Discovery Channel, National Geographic, the History Channel, NPR, and many other television and radio outlets. And he's a songwriter, which I love, and a musician, which I love too. Anyway, it's been a pleasure meeting him, and I've had that opportunity over the last couple of hours. You'll have that privilege now. Dr. Paul Levinson.
Thank you. That introduction was so good, I almost hate to interrupt it with what I'm going to tell you. Let me start by telling you something that just about everyone who knows me knows about me, and that's that I disagree with just about everything that Donald Trump says and does. But at the same time, I realized a little while ago there's something about Trump that actually is very helpful to me. It's helpful to me as a professor. For example, I teach a course called Digital Media and Public Responsibility. I've been teaching that course for about 5-6 years. And as soon as Trump came on the scene politically, the syllabus pretty much wrote itself. So I have to thank him as a professor. And the same exact thing happened this afternoon vis-a-vis our little talk tonight. I don't know how many of you saw it, but this was Trump's press conference after the election result last night. You know, even though the Republicans held on to the Senate, he was obviously somewhat aggravated that the Democrats took the House. So he was a little more touchy and irritable than he usually is, which is saying a lot. But when Jim Acosta of CNN had the temerity to ask him a simple, straightforward question, that unleashed for Trump a typical abusive rant in which Trump said that Jim Acosta and CNN are fake news and enemies of the people. Now, it's easy to laugh about those things, and a lot of people do. But there's something that's also very disturbing about those very words, because the Nazis liked to talk in the late 1920s into the early 1930s before they took over power. By the way, the Nazi Party did get a plurality in 2 elections, so they were democratically elected. That's always an important thing to keep in mind. But once Hitler was appointed chancellor, it was just a brief period of time until he moved from chancellor to Führer. One of the things that Hitler and his minister of propaganda and popular enlightenment, Joseph Goebbels, I mean, I'll say this about the Nazis, at least they were honest about that. You know, they didn't say Goebbels was just like a communication minister. They said he was a minister of propaganda and popular enlightenment. Forget about the popular enlightenment. Joseph Goebbels was a genius when it came to propaganda, which is basically appealing to the emotions of rational people and getting them to feel a certain way, and then in turn getting them to believe that they came to that conclusion rationally. Every element of propaganda does that. It's not just a blatant appeal to emotions. It's emotions mixed in with logic. So one of the Nazi standard lines was the Lügenpresse, which in English means the lying press. Sounds a lot like fake news, doesn't it? And the other big totalitarian country back then in the 20s and 30s was the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin also had a word for anyone that he disagreed with in his Soviet society. It was a phrase, actually, enemy of the people. Now, although the Nazis came up with the Lügenpresse, Stalin himself didn't come up with enemy of the people. This goes back all the way to ancient Rome, where when a senator wanted to denounce another senator in the Roman Senate, they said, this senator is an enemy of the people. But whereas in ancient Rome they didn't then kill that senator, in the Soviet Union, that's exactly what happened when Stalin would identify someone as an enemy of the people. So because of all that that happened just today, and a lot more that's happened since January 2017, I'm going to tell you and spell out for you why I think the greatest threat to our democracy is not the damage that fake news can and has done. It's in fact the clever way that Trump has turned the tables on that label and painted legitimate news media like CNN, the New York Times, NBC, Jim Acosta, etc., as purveyors of fake news. That is actually far more dangerous to our democracy than anything that real fake news can do. And it's sort of odd, isn't it, that we now live in an intellectual climate in which you have to differentiate between real fake news and fake news. When Trump calls CNN fake news, that's fake news. CNN is not fake news. But there are examples of real fake news. The first time it became something that all of us began thinking about and talking about was in the fall of 2016 in the heat of that presidential election. And some of you may recall that there was a story that was bouncing around the internet that a pizza place in the Washington, D.C. area, actually in its basement, had a child predation ring where kids were kept prisoner and all sorts of depravities were done to them. Not only did this fake news paint that pizza parlor in that way, but they identified who was running this ring. And it's interesting. Hillary Clinton was one of the ringleaders. Well, you know, what they wanted to do, the Republicans, is blame Hillary Clinton for everything. You know, if it rained one day when it was supposed to be sunny, it was Hillary Clinton's fault. So, you know, whether we agree or disagree with her politics, the idea that she was involved in a child predation ring is just an extension of a lot of what has been wrongly said about her. There were two other people who were running that ring, according to this fake news story. One was John Podesta, who was the chair of the Hillary Clinton campaign. I don't know why they chose him. Maybe because the name Podesta, sort of sounds like, I don't know, like, some kind of person who preys on kids. Who knows? You can't get into the minds of these people. And just for good measure, they threw in Anthony Weiner. Now, Anthony Weiner did send photographs, explicit photographs, to first adult women and then to women who were underage. So he's not a good guy at all. But even Anthony Weiner never had a child predation ring in the basement of any pizza place or any place. So this became a celebrated and much condemned example of fake news. And one of the questions that Larry mentioned, one of the errors that a lot of people made is somehow, fake news somehow reared its ugly head during that 2016 election. Unfortunately, that's not true. There have been examples of fake news throughout human history. One of my favorite is there's a portrait of Abraham Lincoln, and the portrait shows Lincoln, sitting up really straight, looking very presidential. I'm not the most well-versed historian about Lincoln, but what I did find out when I looked into this is actually Lincoln had a tendency when photographs were taken of him and he was seated to like sort of slouch a little bit. He didn't have the greatest posture. So in a very interesting example of fake news, back when Lincoln was president, it turns out that much admired photograph of then-President Abraham Lincoln was actually the body from the shoulders down of John Calhoun, a Southern senator who, in fact, Lincoln disagreed with. Calhoun was a big advocate of slavery, and they just put Lincoln's head on it. They didn't have Photoshop back then, but, for some reason, Lincoln was involved in a lot of these things. Some of them are sort of tragic. After Lincoln died, a very popular photograph showed poor Mary Todd Lincoln, sitting, on a chair, and you would see like a sort of blurry Abraham Lincoln, walking over to her. Well, obviously, that didn't happen after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. That was fake news in a sense also. And by the way, the reason why I always talk about these things, fake news has always been more than words. A much more recent example of fake news that was photographic was the infamous photograph on the cover of Time magazine of O.J. Simpson, his mugshot, when, for whatever reason, the people at Time magazine made him look much blacker than he actually was. And they basically, Time basically denied it. No, we didn't. What do you mean? And again, I don't know all that much about magazine production. That's not an accident. Someone deliberately decided to make O.J. Simpson look darker. During the Middle Ages, there was something called the blood libel, which basically was spread around Christian communities, and it basically said that Jewish people killed Christian babies and used the blood from these slain Christian babies on Jewish holidays and Jewish ceremonies. And a lot of people back then believed it. So fake news has a long and, in many cases, horrendous history. It's not something that began by any means in the 2016 election. As Larry mentioned, I write science fiction novels and stories. One of my favorite subjects is time travel. I have no doubt that if I could get into a time machine and go back to like the Neanderthals, like say 60,000 years ago, I probably wouldn't understand their language. They did have some kind of language, but if I could sort of listen in and somehow figure out their language, and they're sitting around a campfire in Gibraltar where we've discovered a lot of Neanderthal remains, they were probably, I guarantee you there was some Neanderthal there who was spreading fake news. Because it's human. This is what we do. Doesn't mean that we have to accept it, but it's important to bear in mind that it's been a feature of human discourse throughout history. Now, the fact of the matter is, as far as fake news is concerned, there are some important ingredients that I think it's good to keep in mind. I just got much louder. That's good. I think it's good to keep in mind when we talk about fake news, so we can be clear about what fake news is. First and foremost, fake news is not only false, it's something that is deliberately false. That's an extremely important distinction. The New York Times, for decades, maybe even going back, I don't know how far back, maybe to the 1920s or even earlier, they used to have like a little label called errata, which I always liked because, it sounds classy, Latin, but they got tired of that a few years ago. Now they just call it errors or something. And you can see this just about every day in the New York Times. They basically publish, like a list of articles in which reporters got something wrong. You know what? That's not fake news. That's not deliberate. That's just human beings who try to do the best job they can, and they make mistakes. That's what human life is. The Times is not trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes. All they're doing is trying to present what they think is the truth, and sometimes they get it a little wrong. Sometimes they get it hugely wrong. How many of you remember someone by the name of Jason Blair? Does that ring a bell to you? He was a guy, this guy, I got to give him credit again, getting back to science fiction writing. This guy had a vivid imagination. This guy was like another Hemingway. He basically was assigned a story, like, say, you have to go down to, Miami in Florida to, investigate a crime or something. He didn't feel like going down to Miami. It's a little bit of a hassle. You got to get into a plane. He wanted to just hang out in his Brooklyn apartment and relax, have a bite to eat, watch a little television. But he had an obligation. He knew he had to get this story in. He made it up. He used some real names and just made this up. This went on for a good couple of years. The New York Times and most media are arrogant. There's no doubt about that. And people complain to the New York Times. People who were quoted in Jason Blair's story said, hey, I don't know why you quoted me. I never said that. And basically the Times said, okay, we'll look into it. Nothing ever happened. Finally, irrefutable evidence was presented to the editors of the New York Times. And you know what they did? They apologized to their readers in a front page article. They're not fake news. There's an example in my little book about, I think it was the Christian Science Monitor, were quoting me in a story, and they got my name wrong. This happens all the time, too. It's not that hard a name to remember, but people make mistakes. So I sent them a note and said, hey, thanks for quoting me. I'm always thrilled. But I reminded them of W.C. Fields' famous principle that you can say whatever you want about me as long as you spell my name right. Because you want to get your name spelled right, otherwise you're not getting good publicity. So the Christian Science Monitor, within hours, online, put out a note saying, sorry, we got Dr. Levinson's name wrong. This is what his name is or whatever. So, again, fake news is not mistakes. And not only is fake news not mistakes, you don't have to be a professional journalist to be a legitimate journalist. You can be a citizen journalist and you have no formal training in how to gather news, how to write, etc., etc. But as long as you have a principle that guides you, that you're going to try to the best of your ability to publish stories that are true, even though you might make a mistake, that's not fake news. So, let's get back to the fall of 2016. As we all know, Trump won the electoral vote and therefore became president. I have to admit, I don't understand Trump. I may talk a lot about him, but I really don't get what makes him tick. I mean, if I were elected president, I'd be thrilled. I think Obama was making the same point. I don't know if you saw this, a week or two ago. Obama said, I was pretty happy, when I was elected president. Why are Trump and the Republicans always so angry? And Trump was very angry. The man is elected president, and he's still angry. And I admit, I'm not a psychologist. I don't understand why. But now we get to what I was saying before. It's January 2017. Trump is not yet in the White House. The inauguration is like a week or two away. He's giving another one of his patented press conferences from Trump Towers in New York City, near where I live. Jim Acosta, a reporter from CNN, asked Trump a question. Trump's response: I'm not going to answer your question. You're fake news. So is CNN. No, I'm not answering your question. Sit down. You're fake news. And in that moment, Trump had brilliantly, and I don't know whether it was a plan or an instinct, but the result was a brilliant turning of the tables where Trump takes something that his campaign, and if not his campaign explicitly, certainly people who supported Trump, the people who promulgated the pizza story. And by the way, I should also mention there, that could have had a tragic ending. A lunatic showed up there with a bunch of semi-automatic weapons and fortunately was stopped before he got inside. So those fake news stories were promulgated on behalf of Trump. And in January 2017, Trump wheels around on Jim Acosta, the same Jim Acosta that he attacked today, and denounces him as fake news. And to circle back to what I said earlier, when I heard that, I have to tell you that my blood ran cold. Because one of the things I did in the PhD program at New York University is, one of the modules, as it's called, is we studied propaganda. We studied Joseph Goebbels. We studied an organization called the Institute for Propaganda Analysis that was created in the United States in the late 1930s to try to understand what was going on, what happened in Nazi Germany. And I couldn't believe that when I heard it. But all too quickly, it became impossible not to believe because it wasn't an isolated thing that Trump did. It became one of his standard routines. By undermining the press, by labeling the press as fake news and enemies of the people, what Trump is doing is eroding one of the bedrocks of our democratic society. If you think about it, you can't have a democracy that's going to work if you don't have an informed citizenry. And if citizens and voters can't have confidence in what their news media are telling them. Again, not some kind of blind confidence because, they may make mistakes, and they do. But you can't have confidence in them because you think they're deliberately lying, deliberately not telling the truth, deliberately trying to pull the wool over people's eyes. Then it becomes very difficult for democracy to thrive, or I would say, in the long run, even survive. Back in the 1920s, there was a journalist by the name of Walter Lippmann. He wrote a whole bunch of really good books that they're still very readable. The Phantom Public is one of them. And one of the themes that Walter Lippmann explored, he was very concerned. This was the 1920s, and he said, newspapers may sell a lot of copies, but his experience is most people don't read through the newspapers. They just look at the front page, they go to the crossword puzzle, they look at the sports. They don't really seriously engage. And so Lippmann was saying, I don't know what's going to happen to our democracy. Now, one of the reasons why Lippmann was wrong and our democracy didn't come tumbling down was because right around the exact time that Lippmann was saying that, there was a new mode of news dissemination, radio, which had come into being. And as we all know, radio is much easier to listen to than newspapers are to read, right? Because you could be driving a car and listen to the radio. Yeah, I mean, think about that for a second. I love thinking about how media fit into our world. You certainly can't read a newspaper when you're driving a car, not if you want to get to where you're going and not wind up behind a pole someplace. You certainly can't watch television. Other people in your car can watch television. So all that you can do in terms of news when you are in the radio, when you're in the car, is listen to the radio. And so Walter Lippmann missed this. But I think that did an important service to our democracy. And it's no coincidence that the United States came back with the New Deal, FDR, and, even Eisenhower in the 50s, John F. Kennedy for the short 3 years he was president. I think radio helped make Americans much more aware of the news. What Trump is doing with his labeling legitimate media fake news is far worse than criticizing newspapers, than criticizing radio, than criticizing the internet, than criticizing television. Because Trump uses that label to criticize all sources of news. Donald Trump is an equal opportunity abuser of all news presentations that he finds unwelcome. His calling any reporter, any news medium, fake news or a purveyor of fake news is based on just one thing. Trump doesn't like what that person is communicating. That's his criterion, and he's never going to admit it, but that's his criterion. So this gets me to a question that a lot of people are very interested in, and I enjoyed the video. I think I saw it before. You may have sent it to me at some point. It's an excellent video. The question being, what can we do about fake news? So let me begin by emphasizing something that I think we ought not to do about fake news, because that's just going to make things much, much worse. We have a First Amendment in this country. It says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or the press. Is there anything that's hard to understand about that, by the way? Incidentally, I don't want to get into a whole discussion of comparing the First and the Second Amendment, but I will say that the right of people to bear arms shall not be infringed upon by the government, which is essentially what the Second Amendment says. That's pretty strong, but it's not absolute in the way the First Amendment is. Congress shall make no law. As former Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black liked to say, what else could no law mean? So you do hear people saying, we got to do something about fake news. Let's even give them the benefit of the doubt. They're not talking about what Trump means by fake news, which again is, you're criticizing me? That's fake news. That's Trump's sole criterion for fake news. But there are a lot of people that they're not talking about that. They're talking about the Pizzagate child predation ring. And, obviously it's not in the news now, but what happened on the cover of O.J., with O.J. Simpson being on the cover of Time magazine. A lot of people, well-meaning people, think the government should do something about this. They also think, hey, look, there's an enormous amount of horrible stuff on Twitter and Facebook. There are vile, abusive people on all social media. The last thing we want to do is have the government say those people should be arrested if they don't stop communicating. And even if Trump wasn't someone who is now identifying true news as fake news, it would still be a very bad strategy to compromise the First Amendment in the interest of limiting fake news. And let me just bring something else into this to aggravate you even a little more, because it is a very aggravating subject. We have hate speech on social media. Some psychologists say that hate speech can influence a mentally unstable person to do horrible things like murder innocent people. And it's very tempting to say, okay, we can't take away anyone's guns. That interferes with the Second Amendment, but let's crack down on hate speech. Let's not allow hate speech anywhere. But you know what? The First Amendment was created not to protect speech that we love, but speech that we loathe, speech that we hate. Because speech that we love, communication that we love, doesn't need anyone's protection. We love it. Why does it need protection? But speech that we hate needs protection because it's all too tempting to say, can't the government do something to stop this fake news, to stop this hate speech? And the answer is yes, it can, but it would undermine what I think is another one of the very bedrocks of our democracy, which is the First Amendment. And that never has become more clear with Trump as president. Because if there was some kind of law that made fake news illegal, Trump would no doubt take advantage of it and say, okay, let's arrest the people at CNN. I'm calling Jim, I've been telling you, Jim Acosta's fake news. He's an enemy of the people. Now there's a law that says that's illegal, arrest him. And no doubt he would get some flunky, from the FBI or someplace else. Again, I don't know if you saw the press conference this afternoon. When reporters were trying to ask questions, there was this young woman in her 20s, a flunky, just going up and trying to pull the microphone out of the hands of the people who were asking questions. A woman who had no respect for reporters or the First Amendment simply because her boss is up there bellowing that they're fake news. John Milton, I'm sure you've all heard of John Milton because we all studied Paradise Lost, a great epic poem, in high school. I love that poem. I think it's brilliant. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. I agree with that, actually. Not that I want to be in hell, but if I had a choice, I understand Lucifer's point there. But John Milton is also, and he's not known nearly as widely for this, he also wrote a tract called the Areopagitica, which is a defense of free expression. And in this tract, Milton lays it out, and it's really very clear. He basically says, he argues that human rationality, and again, not everyone is in possession of equal rationality, not everyone is always calm, cool, and collected. He's making a general point that human beings were all possessed of rationality. And because of that rationality, we can distinguish truth from falsity. And because of this, John Milton, I think, very convincingly argues we have to be very, very careful not to try to close out of the marketplace of ideas that we think are noxious, bad, dangerous, because maybe those ideas have some truth in them. And if we, with our rationality, can distinguish truth from falsity, we can't do that if there's no truth in the marketplace of ideas. So this is coming from Milton, not from me, but I agree completely with him on this point, that it's a very dangerous thing to censor anything, because we may wind up censoring something that we don't like. It seems very obvious. We think there's a cause and effect. Let me just say something about cause and effect without going off on too much of a tangent. One of the other things I've studied are the claims that violent video games lead to people doing violent acts. You know what? There is not a scintilla of reliable, accurately conducted statistical evidence that shows that. You know, there are surveys that show kids who play violent video games have more incidences of violence in their lives. That doesn't show that playing a violent video game causes you to be involved in more violent activities. Maybe you just like violence, and so you express it in one way, real-life violence, and you enjoy watching these video games. So let me just wrap up here with one final point which relates to all this. And again, Larry touched on it before. What can we do about fake news that's really fake news, not Trump's nonsense? Because there is really fake news. How can we identify it and root it out? And it's true that Facebook and Twitter and the social media have been very arrogant. First, Facebook said after the 2016 campaign, we didn't do anything wrong. We're not even a news service. We just let people talk about anything they want to talk about. But now they're trying to figure out a way that they can identify fake news. You know what? It's not easy. Something else I know a little bit about are these computer algorithms. It is incredibly complex and difficult. That's why whenever you're having a conversation with words that are generated by a computer, you can see it a mile away. It's not a person you're talking to, it's a program. So, yeah, I'm in favor of social media stepping up their game, at least acknowledging that there are problems in some of what is on social media. But in the end, I think the single best defense, the single best antidote for fake news is human rationality. This gets back again to John Milton. Now, there are some people who don't think human beings are rational. You know, there are some great philosophers. Nietzsche didn't think people were rational. A lot of people regard him as a brilliant philosopher. I think he's brilliant, but I don't agree with his point of view. I think John Locke and John Milton and probably 5 or 6 other philosophers by the name of John had it right. So in the end, I think we all have the ability to identify fake news. We know when something doesn't quite ring true. And again, to touch on something that Larry said, one of the good things about the Internet is when something strikes us and we're not 100% sure if it's true or not, look at other sources. There has never been a fake news story that every single legitimate medium has picked up. So if you go to the New York Times, if you go to NBC, CBS, I'm not sure about Fox. All right, maybe Fox. But if you go to other, sources, you're going to see right away, that insane pizza story again, and there are dozens of those stories. That could have easily been identified as fake news if anybody cared enough to look at other sources. So on that happy note, that you and your inherent rationality are the best way of combating fake news, I'll conclude my talk. Thank you.
And anybody who would like to make a comment or a question, Please, the microphone is in the back. We need you to go to that microphone, not because we want you at a greater distance, but because we are recording this for the podcast. So while you think of what you'd like to ask Dr. Levinson, let me ask you a couple of questions. I think a lot of people misunderstand the First Amendment because when you're talking by the way, at the end of his book, he talks about remedies for fake news. And he talks about all the things that can be done and some of the things that Facebook is doing and validation processes and so forth. So there's some really important work that is going on now to try to combat this. And I talked about it as an offensive and defensive war that is going on. But I don't think people understand that the First Amendment really does not protect the ability of a private company to censor or do whatever it is they want to do. It's only the government. We did another podcast, and anybody listening to this podcast, go find it with Floyd Abrams, one of the great absolutists. Right. So if you would like to talk about that.
Well, two things. Let me just first give an example of the first thing that you're talking about. I've been saying for a long time, I think every account on the Internet, on Twitter, Facebook, any place, should be a verified account. So I have like a little blue check mark next to my name on Twitter. I'm very honored. Thank you, Twitter. They gave me a blue check mark. Wow. I think I don't think anyone should have a blue check mark, or everyone should have a blue check mark, because frankly, everyone should be put through the paces to have their account verified. That in itself would help a lot in reducing fake news. So you don't have people coming on with totally bogus accounts and totally unreal names. But to the second question, Larry raises a very important point, and actually I've come up with a concept that I call the spirit of the First Amendment. As far as the First Amendment itself is concerned, what it restricts government from doing is limiting in any way freedom of speech, press, and speech, has been defined as also broadcasting, the Internet, and so on. And by the way, the 14th Amendment took the language of the First Amendment, which says Congress shall make no law. Right. And the 14th Amendment basically said, hey, you know what? This was after the Civil War. This applies to state governments as well. And the Supreme Court has repeatedly said it applies to every government. So a public school that's in a real sense an arm of the government. The Supreme Court ruled in the late 1960s in their Tinker decision that the First Amendment rights of students are not abrogated when the student walks through a gate into their high school or college or whatever, if the college is a public institution and the high school is a public institution. But Larry's completely right. At Fordham University, which is a private institution, Fordham is not violating the First Amendment if they restrict the rights of students to express themselves. And I have to tell you, I've had some discussions, not heated, but friendly discussions. I know the president of the university pretty well. A few years ago, Ann Coulter was invited by the college Republicans to speak. And there was a real uproar. And I sent a note to the president of Fordham University, and I said, look, I don't know if you're going to listen to me. Whatever you do about this, don't just say it can't happen. Because even though you're not violating the First Amendment, you would be violating the spirit of the First Amendment. And you don't want to teach students that lesson. And so the president of Fordham University came up with the idea of going down to talk to the young Republicans face-to-face, convincing them to withdraw the invitation to Ann Coulter. So, I guess you could argue why should students be subject to that pressure, but at least he told them that if they wanted to invite her, he wasn't going to prevent that from happening. So I think that's a correct way of doing it. As far as the media are concerned, ironically, although the government, according to the First Amendment, can't do anything to restrict them, private corporations, can do whatever they want in terms of restricting things. So I don't know how many of you watch the Grammys. I'll tell you a secret. I don't much. Okay, no surprise. Every once in a while I do. But mainly, I'll be honest with you, not because I like that music all that much. It's okay. But I always find it interesting. Some rapper comes out there singing a song, and rather than hearing the rapper's words, whatever they are, you hear bleeps. CBS has bleeped those words. And I think that's stupid on CBS's part. They have a legal right to do that. But I think they're wrong to exercise that right because it creates precisely the wrong impression.
You talk in the book also about news bubbles. And these news bubbles, in my view, allow a lot of the pranksters and a lot of the fake news adherents, the real fake news, to really determine who we are, what we like, what we don't like, and help to run more division through our politics by virtue of playing to our fears or our hopes or whatever it may be. So how do we get out of those news bubbles, and how dangerous are they in relation to this fake news phenomenon?
Well, news bubbles are a problem. They were first noticed and not called news bubbles by a Harvard psychologist by the name of Leon Festinger in the late 1950s. And he came up with an idea, a principle that he called cognitive dissonance. And the principle was that we, all human beings, do our best to avoid cognitive dissonance. So if we believe something, and then there's like information that contradicts what we believe, our first instinct is going to be to shut that off, turn away from that, because we find it aggravating. And the more that we strongly believe something, the less likely it is to be open-minded about something new that contradicts it. Marshall McLuhan, he's my favorite all-time media theorist. In his book, Understanding Media, takes the ancient Greek myth of Narcissus. I don't know how many of you know that or recall that when you studied in high school. Narcissus was like an incredibly egotistical, very handsome young man. And frankly, he was so egotistical that all he had eyes for was his own reflection. He loved looking at himself. And so there are many different versions of the story. They all involve Narcissus is sitting by a lake and he's looking at himself and enjoying his own reflection, again, his own ideas. And a beautiful nymph comes over. I think her name was Echo, and she tries to seduce him. And he basically says no, and because he's not interested in her, he's just interested in his own face. And in like the worst version, I mean, again, but my favorite version is the worst version. He gets so engrossed in his reflection in the water, he actually sticks his head in the water, falls into the water, and drowns. So this is like McLuhan's point. And more recently, people have talked about news bubbles. But let me just tell you something else I talk about in Fake News in Real Context. I was frankly amazed but happy when I came upon this scientific experiment, this study that was done in Texas just a few years ago. And here's the gist of that experiment. A group of college kids, they did it with various age groups also, were divided up into Democrats and Republicans. And then they were divided again. Some of the groups were told they would have a 1 in 100 chance of winning an Amazon gift certificate if they were able to identify whether something was true or not. You realize how slight the odds are? Anyway, to make a long story short, what the experiment showed is Republicans who were not given that incentive uniformly thought pro-democratic stories were wrong and pro-democratic stories were true, were factual. And Democrats who were not given that incentive, precisely the opposite. They thought pro-democratic stories were true, pro-Republican stories were not true. But when the additional variable of that tiny financial incentive was put into the mix, suddenly Republicans and Democrats identified what was truly correct versus what was in their bubble. So I was delighted when I came upon that study because, again, it proves John Milton's point. This is rationality on behalf of a monetary motive. Good. Whatever it takes. It shows that people can't tell the difference, even if they're in that bubble between truth and falsity.
But I want to talk about the profit motive. I'm glad you brought that up.
Okay.
Because you said something in this book that really struck me. I've been in commercial media. I've been in public media. But believe me, money is still at the bottom of all considerations. You say that professional journalism has more in common with fake news than citizen journalism, in particular the profit motive. I don't think many of us consider that in the midst of watching a news program in general, you're seeing all kinds of messages that are not there to persuade you that they are true. They're there to persuade you to buy, to feel, to emote. So why don't you talk about that? Because I think that's something most of us don't consider.
Well, that's absolutely true. And professional news media are less likely to do nothing else but present the unadulterated truth than citizen journalism. One reason is what the reason you just gave. You can't watch any kind of professional broadcasting unless it's PBS, and even PBS now has commercials, without having your train of thought interrupted by commercials. I mean, it's so bad that my wife Tina was just talking to me about this a couple of days ago on MSNBC, which is about as progressive as you can get, and on NBC, which is a pretty progressive news operation. They were presented with an ad that Donald Trump and the Republicans produced just a couple of days before the election. And the ad was this typical, this caravan is coming, it's invading the United States. By the way, the word caravan, that's something Joseph Goebbels would have approved of. That's not a neutral word. They deliberately, whoever came up with that, thought that that's a good word to describe these poor people because, I don't know, caravan is sort of smacks of like people in the Arabian desert, and that's exactly,
Gypsies.
That's right, what they want us to be afraid of. Anyway, CNN, NBC, and believe it or not, even Fox News refused to air that commercial. But you know what? NBC aired that commercial. And why was that? Money. Because they were being paid a lot of money, and they're not going to say no to it. So that's one serious problem. But there are many other problems in professional media that you don't find in citizen journalism. One is, who decides what the first or lead story is? Who decides what the stories are on the front page of the New York Times or any other paper? And in addition to that, why is it that Walter Cronkite, who I liked a lot, ended every one of his CBS Evening News broadcasts with a serious intonation, and that's the way it was? That's not true. I like Walter a lot, but he was not telling the truth. Had he been totally truthful, he would have said, and that's the way a small group of editors here at CBS think you should think it was. But he's not going to say that because it doesn't scan. And, the New York Times, all the news that's fit to print? I don't think so. The New York Times, a better motto for the New York Times, a more truthful motto would have been all the news that we deem fit to print, because there's some news that the New York Times deems not fit to print. In contrast, citizen journalists, whatever they're doing, they just lay it all out. And I think it's an important addition to our sources of news.
Please come up if you do have a question. Let me ask you one other.
Sure.
I love citizen journalism, but I want you to define that term, and whether it's these little newspapers, a patch in a community, or what have you. However, I watched The Post over the weekend, And when you saw all the folks who were involved in a decision-making process to determine whether they were going to publish Daniel Ellsberg's Pentagon Papers, and you saw all the care that went into that and all the decision-making, no citizen journalist has that many safeguards or that many people who are looking out for the viability, legitimacy. And the point of entry and the cost of entry into journalism today is nil. Anybody can get into it. So what's the risk?
Well, you're completely right. The fact of the matter is this is the raison d'etre of professional journalism. But I'll give you an example, another one of my favorite examples, another scientific, in this case not an experiment, a survey. When Wikipedia first came online, and just so you know the way Wikipedia works, anybody can write anything on Wikipedia. Anyone. There are no editors who say we can accept this or not accept it. Things get taken off of Wikipedia if people who write and read say this is not true. They do have a way of identifying errors in that sense, but there's no editorial board that you have to go through. Wikipedia, as I'm sure you know, is an online encyclopedia. In the early part of the 20th century, I think it's around like 2004, 2005, a magazine called Nature magazine, which is one of the two leading scientific magazines in the world. The other one is Science magazine, published here in the U.S. Nature is published in the United Kingdom. They did a very interesting and upsetting, to some people, survey. They measured the number of errors in Wikipedia, just randomly sampling what they were looking at, and they compared that to the number of errors they found in the Encyclopedia Britannica. And you know what? Statistically, there was no difference between the two levels of error. So that's the answer. All the vetting, and again, Jason Blair was vetted. And for that matter, so was the cover, again, of Time magazine. Whoever it is who did that cover, I don't know if Time has ever revealed that person's name. It was a human being, maybe it was a group of people. But whoever did that cover, they didn't basically say, hey, this is going to be the cover. Other people looked at it. And, sometimes the vetting works, sometimes it doesn't. Just to give you one other example where it does work, the Beatles came out with an album in the mid or so 1960s, and I don't know what got into their head, but basically it was the Beatles with like a bunch of chopped up bloody
butcher
things.
cover.
Yeah, the butcher cover. And basically, this is a fascinating story. Capitol Records and EMI Records, same company, slightly different names, approved the cover. And the Beatles thought that was going to be the cover. At the very last minute, someone pretty high up at Capitol said, you know what, this is disgusting. We're not going to put that cover out. And if you can see the cover online, it is disgusting. So, it's no Rubber Soul or Revolver or Sgt. Pepper, any of those great album covers. But so here's the point. The vetting process did not work in Capitol Records until the very end. So it's an imperfect process. And yeah, even though it's true that citizen journalists have none of those checks and balances, this gets back to what I was saying before. If you read a story online by a citizen journalist and you're not sure whether it's true or not, check around and see whether or not other people have put that story in. Let me just give you one other example. One of my best-known science fiction novels, you probably never heard of it, don't worry, but it's called The Plot to Save Socrates, and it's a time travel story. Not Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. I actually wrote most of my novel before that even came out. But anyway, no problem. In the novel, there is a scene in which William Henry Appleton, who was a great Victorian publisher, lived in Riverdale, has a meeting. Someone comes to visit him, and it's Charles Darwin. And I wasn't sure, did Darwin get to the United States? Well, I looked at the Wave Hill. This is where William Henry Appleton lived, on their website, and it said, among the many visitors to Wave Hill was Charles Darwin. And then I checked around a couple of other sites. That said it too. So here, the book is on its way to being published. The very last thing that happens when you go through a professional publication, after the copy editor, your editor who looks at the content, there's someone called a proofreader who, that's like the very, very last control. So I get like a note from the proofreader saying, Dr. Levinson, I don't mean to speak up out of turn. Are you sure that Charles Darwin, ever came to Wave Hill? So my initial reaction is like I'm cursing my head off. Of course I'm sure. What is this upstart telling me that he knows more than I do about this? I thoroughly researched it. Yeah. But there was a little part in the back of my head which was thinking, hey, you know what? Maybe he's right. To make a long, long story short, I did extensive research, and it turned out Darwin never came to the United States. Thomas Huxley did, and the Wave Hill website had it wrong, and other websites just mindlessly repeated that wrong point. So sometimes, even when you check, you get wrong information. But you got to stay with it and keep on checking.
Thank you, Larry. Earlier in your talk, you talked about the damage that Donald Trump is doing when he casts aspersions on the professional journalists, and how important it is that we be in a position to trust those journalists. Then you talk about what Walter Cronkite should have really said because of the line of editors and so forth that manage all of that. And I mean, we know there is liberal media, we know there's conservative media, and so forth. And where would you class the not so much what they write, but what they choose not to write? And to take it out of the Washington politics for a moment, you look at videos on TV where you see a policeman, abusing somebody, and there's about 10 minutes earlier where the guy's swearing at the policeman and punching him and so forth. But they choose just to give you that piece because it's divisive, it's sensational, and so forth. Is that still in the class of fake news? And how do we,
Yes.
We look at that and then we go and try and find it online to see what else surrounds that. But if you're in that bubble and you're looking at that one station, and we also look at the other network news stations and see that there are oftentimes where what's presented in one is presented very differently in another, and surrounded by the talking heads on one side and another. They all have their agenda, right. And we have to be able to discern that. So how do we deal with that if it's not even reported?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think that's a very good question, and I think the most important part of your question is fake news is not just wrong information or lies that are said, but a very important part of fake news is what is left out of a story to give the wrong impression. That's fake news too. And if, for example, in a hypothetical case that you are describing, you see a police officer responding. Now, just to be clear, I think it's wrong for a police officer to ever use violence against anyone unless they are presenting violence to the police officer. So, but if you see like the police officer being angry and it turns out that 5 or 10 minutes earlier, that person was saying, all kinds of horrible things to the police officer. Yes, that should be presented in the story, and that is a form of fake news. And I would be the last person, that's why I gave those examples, to say we should just blindly trust the media. Again, the difference between the example you gave and Donald Trump is you are citing an example where a television news program left out an essential part of the story to make a point. Donald Trump is not calling news media fake news because of that. He's calling them fake news because he just doesn't like the criticism. And that's, what I'm concerned about.
Anyone else with a question? Let me just pose one or two, and then we can close. But if anybody thinks of anything, please go to the microphone. Steve Brill's been talking about a thing called NewsGuard, and I know a lot of people, when you go to the movies, you know what it's classified, what it's rated, so on and so forth. And he feels that there are these mechanisms that can be built to say you are now entering a space that can be verifiably determined to be journalistically sound, so on and so forth. And he's got human beings actually going out and looking and evaluating these sites. You, at the end of your book, talk about a lot of these efforts that are going on today. Do you think ultimately these are the antidotes that we need?
Well, I think all the things that I talk about at the end of my book, including a course at a university out west. I think it's called Calling Bullshit, and it's a course that's basically designed to teach students how to identify fake news. That's helpful. What I was saying before about Facebook and Twitter, trying a little harder to at least take responsibility for some of the noxious posts that are on their system. I think Steve Brill is a very good idea. That's helpful too. However, the point I would make is 2 points actually. One is we need all of those. No one thing is a magic solution. And again, we have to make sure that we don't put into our solutions something which does more harm than good, which is in some way cracking down on fake news by the government. Let me just mention one thing that's, I think, very useful here. I've talked a lot about philosophers tonight. One of my favorite philosophers is Karl Popper. He was an Austrian philosopher who fled Austria, went to New Zealand, and eventually wound up in England after World War II. He wrote a brilliant book called The Open Society and Its Enemies, very relevant to today. One of the points Popper makes is what he calls the paradox of tolerance. And what Popper is talking about there is we want a tolerant society, but if we're so tolerant that we allow intolerant groups in society to communicate as easily as tolerant groups that have as a goal to destroy our tolerant society, then we're going to wind up destroying ourselves just through that. This has now been cited as an argument in favor of making hate speech illegal. And although I much admire Karl Popper, I utterly disagree. I actually wrote a book about him, as a matter of fact, but I utterly disagree with that part of his philosophy, because as soon as you say because of the paradox of tolerance, we have to crack down on any kind of ideas or communications that's intolerant, we are at that moment becoming an intolerant society. And we have to recognize that. And it's not easy. I don't like these, things. But we have to, keep our wits about us and always be on guard for something that seems to be a helpful medication. But, every once in a while patients die from the medication their doctors give them. We don't want that to happen to our body politic.
And just one thing, because you are in a university setting, and John and I have been doing some podcasts with authors of books about the closing of the American mind, if you will, that a lot of that is going on universities. And, of course, safe spaces and a certain intolerance for abundant, robust, and sometimes, speech that is objectionable. Are you concerned about that on your campus?
Yeah, I'm concerned about it in several ways. First of all, I don't like seeing it on our campus. And there have been swastikas that have been scribbled on student desks. A few years ago, there were a group of Palestinian students. They were Americans, but their heritage was Palestinian, and they wanted to create a club, and Fordham University refused their petition. And I thought that was wrong, because again, ultimately, I think everybody has to make a decision. Either you want to try to respect and maximize freedom of expression, or you take the other approach and you go off, and anytime you see something that seems to be, hateful or whatever, you crack down on it. I think that second approach is far more dangerous than the first.
I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah. A lot of mainstream news organizations maintain a so-called Chinese wall between opinion journalism and their mainstream reporting. The Wall Street Journal might be the best-known example, and the Times, and now even Fox News is claiming the same thing. To what degree do you think those are effective or even real?
Well, let me say this. I am no champion of Fox News, but I've been saying for years that if you think of someone like Bret Baier, who's currently on Fox News, or Brit Hume, who was on Fox News before him,
Shep Smith.
Right, I was just going to say Shepard Smith, that they do seem to have more fidelity to the truth and what's really going on than, let's say, Sean Hannity or Bill O'Reilly or any of those people. So it's a tough line to walk, but I think it's a good line to walk, and I would like to even see more of that.
Any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming. Let me just read the end of this book, and I would encourage you to come back at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning or thereabouts. John, I hope you'll be here on time. And let me end this program with the ending of Dr. Levinson's book. He writes, and this is under the category or the chapter Remedies for Fake News, in the end, as a biological model suggests, the epidemic of fake news can best be combated by a variety of methods, including not deliberately spreading illness. Government and scientific agencies should tell the truth. Washing of hands or removal of pathogens before they enter the body, meaning curating posts and validating accounts. Antibiotics, aggressive introduction of truth to combat the lies. And strengthening the immune system, education about how to recognize fake news. But just as we can never eradicate all disease-causing viruses and bacteria, we can expect to be in a never-ending battle with fake news. And just as with illness, battling fake news can sometimes make us stronger. Like illness, fake news is part of life. And like life, the spread of fake news may have unexpected consequences. So, there it is. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and thank you, John, for making the library available. And again, there are many books here available for you on the topic. Thanks for coming tonight. We really appreciate it. And Dr. Levinson, thank you for coming from New York to be with us tonight.